Hi friends, welcome back to number 3 in our chess series on how to play chess. Now, remember last week we reviewed how the pieces moved. We were discussing en passant, the way pawns can capture by going diagonally off their files. We discussed kingside castling, queenside castling, and I want to stress at the tail end of the program how important it was to learn your basic mates. Here we have one of our basic mates, which I showed you. It's the knight and bishop against the king. The bishop can move up here and say check, attacking the king. And you notice the king cannot move here or here because of the king here. The king cannot move to the white square because of the knight. Notice the knight moves 2 and 1 from a black to a white. So the king is in check, cannot move out of check, therefore checkmate. And we have similarly a checkmate with 2 bishops and a king. Here, this bishop on the white square is preventing the king from escaping to the h7 square. That's a checkmate. Now, strangely enough, you cannot checkmate with just a bishop and a king. You cannot have a checkmate just with those 2 pieces on the board. That would be a draw game. Nobody would win. You cannot checkmate with just a knight and a king. That's also a draw game. You cannot force a checkmate, although you can devise one, but you cannot force a checkmate with 2 knights and a king. So what is required if you're white, in this case, and you want to checkmate the king, you require a queen and a king, or a king and a rook, or a king, knight, and bishop. That can force a checkmate. Or 2 bishops. 2 bishops and a knight. That can force a checkmate. When you do it with the bishop, you have to have the king forced into a corner so that you can deliver checkmate like so. Checkmate. The king has to be forced into the corner. Now you can play these out at home. Like I've said, you must learn your basic checkmates. You can start and set up any position on the board and play both white and black and see how you can force the king into a corner, and the corner he's chased into, either white or black, depends upon which bishop will be doing the final checkmate. Be careful of stalemate. In other words, you want the king, the opposing king, to have a move if he's not in check. Otherwise, it's a draw game because of stalemate. Keep that in mind. Now, the simplest, as we've shown, the simplest is to have a queen because she's so powerful. And we have the checkmate here, checkmate there. Now, because it's so easy to get checkmate with queen and king, a lot of games depend on a position like this. Say everything has been traded off the board, exchanged off in the course of the battle, and white is left with 1 pawn. 2 kings and 1 pawn. The trick then is to advance this pawn, if you can, promote the pawn into a queen. You know, this king might be over here. Promote it into a queen, then you have your basic checkmate. Now that's why it's so important. We don't very often get down to an endgame where we're up a queen. Your opponent should have resigned long ago. But we can get into lots of games where we're up only 1 little pawn. But that little pawn can be promoted into a queen, and we have our basic, easy method of checkmating the king. So that takes us into a study of the endgame. The endgame basically is how can we promote a pawn when there are just 2 kings on the board? Well, we have a position, say, like this. And it's black to move. Black wants to stop this pawn from advancing to this square and becoming a queen, which will result in our basic checkmate, our elementary mate. Black has to move. Say black doesn't know this ending. He can go astray. Say black, he cannot go here and he cannot go here because the pawn can capture diagonally. The king is not allowed to move into check. So say the king moves here. White follows in with his king. Now this king has to stop this pawn, so he moves in here. The pawn advances. The king cannot take the pawn because two kings cannot be together, right? The king must move. The king cannot move here or here. See, the pawn covers that square. King covers this square. The king cannot move to e8 because the pawn is attacking it. The king can only go out. It's only move. White then advances the king to allow this pawn to queen. You see, if I pushed the pawn now and made it a queen, the king would just take it. You see. But if I push my king up, now there's nothing to stop this pawn from becoming a queen because the king is protecting it. Now let's look at that key position very closely. This is the key position. Black makes the wrong move in this position. Black moves to the side. The king comes in, opposite the king. King moves to stop the pawn advance. The pawn moves forward. The king only has one square to move out here. This king, white king, moves forward. Black has to move. He can't go here or here. The pawn covers that square. The king covers this square. Therefore, the king just has to move somewhere. Then you come in and you promote the pawn to a queen, and you have your elementary mate. You force the king to the side, and eventually you'll have the checkmate like this. So, the importance of having one pawn. Now, very good players, when they're playing against each other in some positions, if they're one pawn down, they'll resign because they respect the ability of the opponent, knowing that the end game will end up something like this. But you have to play a lot of games to prove to yourself you're capable of proving the point. Let's see how black should play this position. Instead of going to the side, black comes straight back. White has no choice but to advance. If he advances the pawn, it'll be taken. So he moves his king up. Black then comes in front of the white king. White has nothing else to do but to advance with a check. Check. The king has to stop the advance, moves in here. Now where is the white king going to move? Can't come in here because two kings can't be together. So the king, if it moves away, will lose the pawn. You see, and that's a draw game. Draw game. So the king has to protect this pawn, has to move here. Now black has no move. Black cannot move here or here because the pawn is attacking those squares. And the king cannot go out here because the king. So the black king cannot move, yet it's not in check. And not being in check and not having a move means it's a stalemate. That's a draw game. Let's look at that once more. It's a very important position. You can imagine that the position started way down here with lots of pawns. And you can imagine that pieces are being exchanged. And you can imagine that this one lonely pawn has advanced this far. And having gotten up to this point, black knows the right method, moves straight back, so that when the king comes in like this, he can get in front of the king. The whole idea being, if white moves the pawn in with check, it's going to be a draw. Stalemate. You see? Now, in the other position, when he made a mistake and moved here, When white moves in without a check, that's not a check, you see. It's going to be a win for white in an eventual advance. The key position for all endgames is this position. Now, we're going to develop our study of the endgame as we go on. We'll also be discussing theories of the opening, how to develop your pieces, like I showed you last week, the ideal opening, getting your pieces out towards the center. But remember, when you're playing chess, the importance of one pawn. Because that one pawn, after many, many exchanges, will leave you a pawn up. And that one pawn up can eventually be promoted to a queen, and you have your elementary mate. But remember, if you're black in this position, you must move straight back in order to achieve the draw. Black wants to draw this game. You move straight back so that it will end up like this, with a stalemate. Now this, you can practice this on any file and on any rank. You can push the king back. We will show variations of this ending. We will show endings like this, endings like this. We will show endings like this. Many different endings, but they all are based upon this basic key position. Remember, when you're black, to move straight back. If not, if you go to the side, you will lose. So much for our ending theory right now. But I wish you would practice this at home, because it's really, if you've learned a lot, if you can learn this one simple position of how to promote the pawn and of how to prevent that pawn from being promoted to a queen. Now, I want to remind you that we have a post office box, and it's box 7025, Station A in St. John. And this will be repeated at the end of the program. You'll see it as a credit at the bottom of your screens. And I welcome all the letters. I'll answer them personally. If you have any questions, any queries, if there's anything specific you'd like to see or answered on the show, please write. I'd like to show you the mate that's possible with two rooks, because it's pretty. Let's forget about the king. The king has to be somewhere on the board, but let's forget about it. When you have two rooks on the board and a king, try not to have the rooks working on either the same rank or the same file like this. This is very strong in the middle game, but in the end game, they should be able to overlap each other like this. You see? Now I'll show you how simple it is. The first thing we do is we want to get the opponent's king to the back of the board. So the first thing to do is to occupy a rank. We don't check him because he can come out. It's a waste of time. So the first thing we do is we occupy the rank right in front so the king cannot get out. He's now limited to this half of the board. So the king moves. Okay, say the king moves over here. If the king moves over there, we cannot check him as we would like, because the king could take the rook. So we simply waste the move. We use a tempo. We come down. And now the king has to move away. Now we can come up and say check. The king cannot advance here because the rooks control these ranks. If the king comes down, it has to come back. This rook controls the fifth rank. We can overlap by coming like so. Notice the check. If that were the back of the board, it would be checkmate. Right? The king comes back. Overlaps with the check. We still have this controlled, so the king can't come out. The king is forced back. Checkmate. That's a nice little checkmate with the two rooks. You can practice that at home too. We also have in chess, one of the nicest things in chess are our chess problems. Some of our problems arise out of actual positions. Say the black king has castled in a position like this. And I'll just set up a position which we will look at later, but just for fun, we'll put it up now. Okay, we need a white king on the board somewhere, so let's put it up here. Now, the black king has castled. He hasn't moved any of his pawns in front of the castled king. And white, in 1, 2, 3 moves, has a checkmate. And it's all forced. Now, this might be jumping a little ahead of our theory, but I want to show you what's possible in chess, because they're pretty. It's white's move. White to move and mate in 3. That's the way we say it. So watch this. The knight can move 2 and 1 from a white to a black. So we come in. That's our first move. It can't be taken by any piece. The rooks can only go horizontally. And we say check. You notice the knight can go over 2 and down from a black to a white. We are now attacking the king. Right? The king has only one thing to do. He has to move away. But remember, this square is now occupied by this knight. Now it's going to be a mate in 2. We've used up one of our moves. Now I'll just try to drag it out to see if you can see the mate in 2. That's enough time. The queen now sacrifices herself. Now this is one of the nice things about chess. The queen is your most powerful instrument on the board. But this is a case of mind over matter. And that's one thing that lures us to the art of chess, is that matter doesn't really mind that much if you exchange it off for the end result. Queen takes pawn. Queen can go anywhere. Queen comes right down, takes the pawn, and says check. Well, the king can't go anywhere but take the queen. The queen has sacrificed herself. King takes queen, and now the rook goes across the rank and says check on the file, and that's checkmate. Do you see the checkmate? This knight, 2 and 1, from black to white, is stopping the king from going back either here or here. And the king is being attacked by the rook on the file. The king cannot escape. Checkmate. Now let me set up the position and look at it as though you were studying it for the first time. Now you know the result. The knight comes in with a check. The king moves over. The queen sacrifices herself on h7. King takes. The rook slides over with the checkmate. And very common in chess is this type of mate, where we have the king stuck in a corridor, we call it. He's castled, but the pieces have moved out. The king is behind the pawns in a corridor, and something comes down like a rook or a queen and says checkmate. We call that a corridor mate. See, the rook could do it too if the rook were over here. Checkmate. The only black can't get out of that. It's a mate. If black had a knight here, the knight could come back from a white to a black, see 2 and 1, and interpose it. See, that would get out of the mate. But in this, in the position we showed, it's just checkmate. Say we have 2 pieces on this square, and black has an extra piece protecting it. See, if we had 1 piece and we came down for a check, it wouldn't be checkmate because the rook would take the queen. But if we have 2 pieces and black only has 1 defending the back row, then the queen can also sacrifice herself here, check. The king would be in mate except for this. So we have another piece down here, the rook, which moves up on the file, and checkmate. So there's another queen sacrifice. We'll see lots of queen sacrifices. And the point I'm trying to make is that what are the relative values of the pieces? The pieces have value only insofar as they are mobile and insofar as what they can do. A lot of books will tell you that the knights are worth 3 points and pawns are worth 1 and queens are worth 9. But that doesn't mean too much. Remember, the mobility of the piece and what it is doing is what is important. So, and remember, in the opening of the game, to develop your pieces as quickly as you can. The end game, which has to do with just kings and pawns, is a matter of technique. This technique can be learned. You can study this technique. There's not that much art to it. It's a precise calculation for the end game. But when it comes to the opening game, there are so many different systems of achieving the ideal position, or trying to achieve it, that all we have to do are study the different systems that have evolved in the course of time. I'd like to, at this point, remind you that there is a chess club in St. John, and it meets every Friday evening at the YMCA on Hazen Street, and or is it Hazen Avenue? I'm not sure. And but it's at the YMCA on Friday nights from about 7:30 to the last person who resigns, leaves. Why do we exchange pieces in chess? Why would you capture another piece? You have to have something in mind before you decide to do so. Remember last week we said we bring our rooks towards the center of the board early in the game, behind files where we expect pawns to be exchanged. Well, that's one reason for exchanging pieces. An example, say I open up with my e-pawn to e4, and black does the same thing. His king pawn comes out to e5. Now, as I said, these two pawns cannot capture each other because they're deadlocked. They can only capture by moving diagonally, right? Now, excuse me, if white were to move this pawn right up immediately, I said that would be ideal. Now, that would be fine, except after black exchanges and white you don't allow a person to take a piece for nothing. After black exchanges, you take back with the queen. Now, you might think you have a nice centralized position with both your bishops open, but the problem is that black now develops a piece, the knight. Now the knight is attacking the queen. Remember I said, try not to bring your queen out too early. This is one reason. The knight is coming out, developing force, attacking the queen. Now white, instead of bringing out more force, has to waste time by moving the queen away somewhere where it'll be safe. In which case black can bring out another piece, or a bishop, or develop this pawn to bring out the other bishop. But this is a key thing in the opening. When to exchange. Try not to exchange so that your queen is forced out too early. You notice white in this position, instead of being up a tempo, is down a tempo because the queen has moved twice. Instead of having an extra piece out in the center, black has two knights already developed. And black should be behind the tempo. There is another reason for exchanging, and that is in what we call the gambit. A gambit is when you exchange force. When I say force, I'm referring to the pieces. Okay? Like a pawn or a knight or a rook or a bishop. That's your force. One reason for exchanging is to give up force to gain space. And that's a gambit. Let me show you an example. Black moves out here. White moves this pawn out. Black takes. Now white is down force, down in a pawn. Instead of bringing the queen out where she could be chased away, as I've shown, white plays a gambit, gives up more force. Black takes. Now white takes with the knight. Now, the position is such that it's 2 pawns to 1. White is down in a pawn. White is down a pawn, has given up force, but look at the difference in space. This knight is developed. Both bishops can be developed towards the center very quickly, which means that castling can take place very quickly. Look at the position for black relative to white's. Only this square has been vacated, and this bishop and the queen, which you want to bring out early anyway, is free, but it is otherwise going to take a long time for black to develop the pieces relative to the speed with which white can develop. So in all gambits, the idea is very risky. The idea is to give up one or two pawns to gain space and time. Rapid development, rapid deployment. I'll show you next week what to do with rapid deployment and how to take advantage of it. But the idea of all gambits is to give up pawns to develop quickly. Now, remember what the danger is. If black can equalize the game, white will be a pawn down. And if it's a pawn down, we're going to get into our ending that I showed you at the beginning of this show, with a king and a pawn against the king, and perhaps that pawn will be advanced, promoted to be a queen, and we have our elementary basic mate. So the risk in gambits are that the risk in the gambit is that black can equalize perhaps and then start exchanging down to what we call a one ending, being up that pawn that white sacrificed. On the other hand, if white is an attacking player and if black is timid, his rapid deployment in a gambit could pay off, and he hopes to attack full force very quickly. But gambits are very risky against very good defensive players who can withstand the onslaught and trade off to a one ending. That's it for tonight, and I hope you've learned something, and I hope you'll send in some letters and watch again next week. Thanks a lot.